We'll show the film here in just a minute, but before we start, I wanted to say a couple things. During this film, you'll see every tool right here being used. See if you can find them. Look at them. This tie is one that came from our place, but originally it came from Steve Symmeter's grandpa's place. That's where the track went through his place, south of town here. It's noted there and so forth. This is Steve Symmeter. You may have heard of Symmeter Cemetery. That's from his namesake. Your grandpa donated that cemetery. Okay, so he's from south of here a little bit, but we're glad to have him tonight. This tie was hand hewn with a broadex. I looked around to find it, but you can see the marks. You can see where it was cut here and there and down here, all with a broadex. And so it's kind of a unique tie, but there was a lot of them that were hand hewn. It also has a dig nail in it. That would tell you how old that tie is. You can look at it in a little bit and so forth. The end irons here were used to keep it from splitting. You'll see that in the film. Does anybody know what this is? Somebody used it?
Turn to many love with them.
Turn to many. What's the name of it? Cant hook. Cant hook. Does anybody know why it's called a cant hook? I've been told that when they put a log on the trolley on the sawmill and they cut one side of it, they called that a cant. And they used a cant hook to turn it, to saw it. Is that right?
That'd be right.
Okay. All right.
I never heard it said that way, but it would be correct.
Yeah, that's what I've been told.
No, we run our mill for years of turning with one of these.
Yeah, you'll see the cant hook being used there. You'll see them chopping. When they felled a tree, right there, we already kind of saw that. They'd cut in with a crosscut saw, then they'd chop out the notch, then they'd go around the other side and cut it and fall it the way the notch was cut. This was donated to the Historical Society, and you'll see this being used.
Be a tie hook.
Yeah. And what they did is, you'll see it, when they moved ties around on a load or in the water, they would snag that tie, and then they could handle it and pull it without getting down there, trying to get a hold of it. This is a set of log dogs. They tied their rafts together by driving one spike in one end and the other in another, and they had several of these, and they tied their rafts together with a set of log dogs. I went up behind the house and cut this pole to make this more authentic. You can see how that looks there. You can guess how that was used, I'm sure. That was for moving logs around in the water, and you could push and you could pull. It didn't have a handle, but anyway, I got that from behind the house just to show it. So anyway, any questions so far? All right, you look for the tools that are being used on there. Now, I've watched this film, I know, a dozen times, and I enjoyed it every time. And you have to watch it a couple times to catch the little details and so forth. All right, Cheryl?
The forest land of Missouri features some of the finest oak, walnut, pine, and red cedar trees anywhere. But the forests we enjoy today are very different from the forest a century ago. Hi, and welcome to Missouri Outdoors. I'm Kip Woods. On today's show, we're going to turn back the hands of time to an era when intense manual labor and animal-powered wagons were the norm. Missouri was in the midst of a logging boom, one that would have a lasting impact on the lives and the landscape of the region. It's a time that will not soon be forgotten by those that work the timber.
Missouri's great forests cover about a third of the state, mainly in the Ozarks. The character of this land, its wildlife, its recreation, its water and wood resources, depends on the trees. It's been that way for more than a century. Though the rivers flow quietly through wooded hills today, they were the sites of great activity in the early 1900s. Railroad ties and lumber produced in this region helped develop the nation. The old motion picture footage that follows was taken in the 1920s and gives us a rare look at a fascinating part of the Ozarks past, when forest covered 2/3 of the state. This is the story of the railroad crosstie, from tree to track. All of the operations shown are of and by the T.J. Moss Tie Company of St. Louis that was founded in 1879. In 1888, the company was the largest supplier of railroad ties in Missouri. It was acquired by Kerr-McGee Corporation in 1963. Its operations continue today. Working this virgin timber into lumber and ties put cash money into the Ozark economy. Without the logging industry, economic development of this region probably would have been greatly delayed. It all began with the felling of the tree. A logger cut a notch on the side towards which he wanted the tree to fall. The cut was then completed with a 2-man crosscut saw. It was a dangerous process. Trees could fall in an unexpected direction or spring back when they hit the ground. After the tree was down, limbs and branches were removed and the log cut into 8-foot lengths, since 8 foot was the standard length of a railroad crosstie. Red and white oak were the preferred species, but other hardwoods were also used.
I've cut lots of logs with a crosscut saw for 10 cents a log.
Well, I kind of liked it, but it was hard work and everything. But that's about all I ever done, was just worked in the timber.
They just always done that, and that's what they wanted to do. They liked to do it.
Cross ties were manufactured by one of 2 methods, either by hand hewing or by sawing. A person who hewed ties was called a tie hacker. He stood on top of the log and scored along its edges at intervals of 4 to 8 inches. The scores, or juggles as they were called, were popped out, and the faces hewn down to the desired width and smoothness with a broadaxe.
When they got together, they talked about how many they could do. There was competition in that. They would actually take pride in the number of ties they could hew in a day and how smooth they were, and so forth.
You couldn't get in a big hurry. You just work at it. And it was hard work, all right.
Boy, you got the more money you got, and that's the way we done it.
Well, it was hard work. We made ties there back in the late 20s and all through the 30s. It wasn't worth much, but that's all, well, we had to make them live.
And there just wasn't much else to do except timber and make a garden and farm a little. That's all I knowed.
With larger logs, a hacker could obtain 2 ties by splitting the log with a broadaxe and iron wedges. Ties were not considered well hewn if the score marks were more than half an inch deep or the surfaces were uneven. After the 2 ties were split, the 4th side of the tie was smoothed with a broadaxe. It took about an hour to hew a tie. Hackers earned 10 cents for each tie produced. A good hacker on an average day could complete about 8 ties. Many farmers were able to earn extra money during the winter by hewing ties. company had 40 sawmills operating on a 36,000-acre tract in Reynolds County. Logs were brought in from the woods on wagons pulled by teams of mules. At the sawmill, the logs were unloaded and stacked into log decks to await processing. The men used cant hooks to move the logs. The hook on the long handle gave them the leverage to roll large logs. Unlike other lumber companies in the area, which had one large sawmill, the T.J. Moss Company had many small mills. Those mills helped them cut the costs of building miles of tram lines that would have been needed to haul logs to a centralized location. Most of the logs were made into cross ties, but some would be sawn into grade lumber and flooring as well. An expert sawyer was the key to a profitable sawmill. The sawyer determined how the log would be cut to obtain the highest grade of lumber. He's the man on the left, controlling the movement of the log carriage. The man riding the carriage is the block setter. Through a system of hand signals, the sawyer told the block setter how far to advance the log. 1 finger meant 1 inch, 2 fingers, 2 inches, and so on. Actually, it was a little more complicated than that. Since the saw blade was 1/4 inch thick, the block setter had to allow for the saw curve. So to cut a 1 inch board, the log was advanced 1 1/4 inches. Usually several sawing operations were taking place at the same time. The men in the background are running an edger, which cut the lumber to various widths, while others would cut it to different lengths. The cross ties and lumber were separated as they came out of the mill. Ties were rolled into one pile, lumber into another.
I worked many a day for 50 cents, from daylight till dark. I don't think you do that, but you go to getting hungry and you might do it.
I worked with my dad, helped him there all through the 20s, well, from 25 on up to, I guess, mid-30s. He run a mill for the Moss Tie Company. And I helped him, and in 50, I bought a mill of my own, and I sawed ties and lumber for the Moss Tie Company.
And the very best of times back then, you worked 10 hours for $2. That was the going wage. If you could get that, you might work for less, but hardly anybody got over $2 a day for a 10 hours work.
They were out of work. They got a claim on a creek somewhere and was trying to get a living out of what little ground they had along the creeks. And when someone came in with a sawmill, they were ready to go to work.
We made it. I don't know how we made it, but we made it. Lots of people in this country then. Man, the woods is full of people.
I worked a sawmill in 42 for $1.25 a day. After me and my wife was married, I think it'd come to about $7.50 a week. I had a Model T car. Tires wore out on it. But I saved up enough money working for $1.25 a day to buy me 4 tires for that Model T.
Ties were loaded onto wagons and hauled to the riverbank and allowed to air dry for about a year so they'd float in the river drive. Lumber was stacked with thin strips of wood separating the layers to speed drying and help prevent decay. The sawmills were located far from railroads, making transportation of the cross ties to the treating plant difficult. The easiest way to move them was by a river drive. Ties were thrown into the small creeks in the headwaters of the rivers and floated downstream to a railroad crossing. The company made the first river drive on the Black River in 1908, and the last one tied up at Clearwater in September 1926. During that time period, ties were floating on some part of the river at all times. The drives began far up the east, middle, and west forks of the Black River, and more ties were added as the raft moved downstream, some 30 to 40 miles to the Missouri Pacific Railroad siding at Clearwater. The drive started about the 1st of June each year. Some of the larger drives contained more than 250,000 ties and took 4 months to complete. Usually only a mile or two of progress was made each day. The river hogs, or pigs as they were called, worked a 10-hour shift and were paid $1.75 a day plus meals. The men worked, ate, and slept along the river while on a drive and were wet to the skin most of the time. When the drive reached the railroad crossing, men, teams of horses and mules, and wagons would be standing by to pull the ties from the river and carry them to waiting railroad cars. A tie boom, constructed of pilings, wooden timbers, and heavy steel cable, was stretched across the river to stop the ties at the takeout point. About a quarter mile above the boom, wagons were backed into the river for loading ties. Each wagon held 20 to 25 ties. For this particular operation, the company had 40 to 50 teams hauling ties. Many of the teamsters were independent operators. They supplied their own equipment and teams. Mules were preferred over horses because they could handle the heat of the summer and were less excitable. Their loads were counted and the men were paid according to the amount of ties they hauled to the rail cars.
It was hard work following an old mule up and down the hill all day. And when night comes, you're ready to tie up to the bell.
Gangs of men called shoulder crews loaded the cars. 2 men called headers picked up a tie and placed it on a cushioned leather shoulder pad of the carrier. Some of the ties weighed several hundred pounds. Box cars had to be loaded by hand. The springy oak planks looked precarious, but they actually made the loading easier as they bounced the man and his tie up into the car. Each man loaded, on the average, about 200 of the heavy water-soaked ties a day. The ties were pulled from the river with either a chain-driven conveyor or a steam-powered Barnhart loader. The loader could pull ties directly from the river and swing them into awaiting rail cars. Even though the mechanized loaders were being used more, there still was a tremendous amount of manual labor involved in retrieving ties and loading them for shipment to the treating plants. The work was slow, and when the main drive came in, ties could be backed up the river for miles. After 1925, T.J. Moss and other tie-producing companies working in the Ozarks agreed to a plan that would help protect fish spawning by halting tie rafting operations during the period from April 15th through June 1st. There was concern that the tie drives disrupted spawning. The railroad brought the loading crews in daily from faraway communities to the work site and returned them at day's end. There were no accommodations for them to stay the night.
And it took a lot of men to move the amount of timber that they were producing.
You never did walk with a tie. You couldn't do it. You had to run with it. Up that board, get that board helping you, you know. No, you couldn't just pick one of them up and walk in the car with it. You'd give out in just a little while. And I was about about 17 or 18 years old. I was a pretty good sized boy. I weighed around 180. And I loaded ties at Winonis, and the next morning I couldn't get my breeches on, couldn't get my pants on. I was stiff and sore. And I had to get up and work the sawmill there to be all right. For next weekend, you had to go back. Yeah, we worked. There wasn't much work. That's the reason. Carried ties for a penny a piece or a cent and a half for $2 a day or so. Yeah, it was different then. Of course, I guess we didn't know any better and thought we was doing good.
During the 18 years the T.J. Moss Tie Company conducted tie drives on the Black River, more than 4.5 million ties were floated from Lesterville to Clearwater. That was more than enough to build 1,000 miles of mainline railroad. And more importantly, no one working for the company drowned or was killed while working on a river drive. In building a timber treating plant, one of the essential factors was accessibility to railroads. Not only were the railroads the principal consumers of cross ties, they were also the main, and in most cases the only, means of transportation. The company's East St. Louis plant was located about a mile south of the city and could serve all of the 23 railroads coming into the St. Louis area. It covered about 70 acres and provided sufficient room to maintain an inventory of 1.5 million ties. Entire trainloads of cross ties were constantly rolling into the plant from their cutting operations in the Ozarks. The ties were unloaded and carefully stacked for proper seasoning before being treated. Oak ties had already seasoned a year or more before treating. Pine ties, on the other hand, were ready for treatment within 4 to 6 months. The plant had 2 Browning locomotive cranes for loading and unloading ties. They operated under their own power and traveled over standard gauge tracks. Driving metal S-irons into the ends of the ties prevented excessive checks and splits while they were being seasoned. There were 2 Davenport steam locomotives for moving the trams around the plant. They ran on 24-inch gauge railroad tracks. The company also purchased seasoned ties from independent suppliers. They were unloaded directly from boxcars onto the awaiting trams. After the proper seasoning time, the ties were ready for treatment. The loaded trams were moved from the tie yard into the treating cylinder. A heavy cable was placed over the lead load of ties. The trams weren't connected, so the cable made it easier to retrieve the string of trams from the chamber after treatment. The cylinders were 150 feet long and 74 inches in diameter, and could hold 700 to 900 ties, depending on the size of the ties. After the chamber was sealed, a vacuum was drawn inside the cylinder, helping pull the moisture from the ties. Then the creosote was added under pressure to force the chemical into the wood pores. After pressure treating for a specific time, the creosote was pumped out and the trams of treated ties were pulled from the cylinder. The ties might have been moved to a concentration area or loaded directly into railroad cars for shipment. As in their woods operation, much of the loading and unloading of ties at the treating plant was done by manual labor. The two Browning cranes were also used for loading gondola cars and moving ties around the yard. The 20-ton cranes could load 7,000 ties in a 10-hour day. That was about equal to the efforts of a 20-man loading crew. Often, entire train loads of treated ties were sent to areas where new railroad tracks were being built. There was rapid growth in wood preservation during the early 1900s. In 1912, there were only 87 plants. By 1922, there were 128 wood-preserving plants in operation in the entire country. At first, most of the ties used by the railroads were untreated and lasted about 5.5 years. During this time period, there was an abundance of tie timber available, but its rapid depletion and the rise in prices of commercial species demanded better methods of treatment to prolong the life of the tie and extend the timber resource. A creosote-treated moss tie company cross tie could typically be expected to give 20 to 40 years of service. Many have lasted over 50 years, as evidenced by dating nails used years ago to indicate the year of installation. The stamp of character brand meant T.J. Moss Tie Company Cross Ties Plus. Plus for the security of their ownership of thousands of acres of standing timber. Plus for a stock of ties always on hand. Plus for the absolute control of the treating process. Plus for a warranty that their product would be delivered as promised. And plus for the pride and ambition of all men who stood behind the brand.
While much of the Ozarks land had been stripped of its timber in a span of about 40 years, the T.J. Moss Tie Company maintained ownership of their land and began good forest management practices, including tree planting and fire protection. Those practices continued as ownership of the land passed hands in 1963 to the Kerr-McGee Corporation. Nearly 80,000 acres of this land is now available for public use after the Missouri Department of Conservation purchased it in the early 90s. Although the present forest includes more hardwoods than the pre-settlement pine forest, it stands as a testament to the renewability of the forest resources in the state. Today, the amount of forest land in Missouri is on the rise. Our forests are growing 2.5 times faster than they're being harvested. Missouri's timber industry provides thousands of jobs and contributes about $3 billion each year to the state's economy. The state of Missouri has more than 14 million acres of forest land. 85% is owned by private landowners. Forests are Missouri's greatest renewable resource. If managed wisely, a healthy forest will keep producing quality trees for years to come, creating tremendous economic, environmental, and social benefits. Thanks for watching.
This next one will be on the Grandin Mills.
I didn't see no EPA people there, did you?
This one's not as long as the first one.
They shut them down on the creosote, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Well, they'd last though, wouldn't they, if they had
You
creosote
betcha.
on it?
Looks like you get the wrong one. I'm sorry. Let me go back. I think that's it.
Missouri, 1870. This was the land of untold riches and unexploited resources. Virgin forests covered nearly 2/3 of the state. The most valuable timber stood in the rugged pine forests of the southeastern Ozarks. A century of colonial demand left little of the forest in the eastern states, and those of the South still suffered from the ravages of the Civil War. America was growing west, and Missouri's timber was desperately needed to build new railroads, industries, and cities in turn-of-the-century America. Tall, ancient trees stood in the Ozarks. Their open, grassy understories were often described as prairies by the area's early inhabitants. These forests played a vital role in the development of our country. This is the story of those forests. It begins at a small natural pond known as Tolliver Pond in Carter County. A boomtown called Grandin arose there. It became the home of one of the world's largest sawmills, run by the Missouri Lumber and Mining Company. The nation's industrial cities were far, far away from the backwoods roads of the Ozarks in the 1870s. Railroads hadn't pushed deep into the region, and small streams couldn't carry much traffic. The few wood products produced in this rugged country were used by the scattered inhabitants for houses and barns. Only small amounts of lumber could be hauled out by wagon over rutted forest trails that served as roads. A small group of Pennsylvania oilmen saw the profit that awaited them in these sleeping pine forests. They eventually purchased more than 300,000 acres in Reynolds, Butler, Carter, Ripley, and Shannon counties, paying on the average about $1 an acre. The new general manager, John Barber White, persuaded the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Memphis Railroad to construct a branch line from Willow Springs to the small town of Lakewood, located near Tolliver Pond. The new location, renamed Grandin after the mill owners, afforded room for the mill facilities, a business district, and a residential area in the nearby hills. White began purchasing the new mill's heavy machinery, a steam locomotive and 6 miles of iron rails. Beaver Dam Soft Pine became the trade name of Grandin's lumber. Its strength, appearance, and ability to take a fine finish quickly attracted major markets in Nebraska, Kansas, and the Indian Territory. The Big Mill, as it was called by the workers, began producing lumber in 1889. This giant bandsaw mill could handle logs 16 feet long and over 4 feet in diameter. On the other side of Tolliver Pond was the Little Mill, so named because of its saw's slightly smaller size. Adding to the lumber output was a circular sawmill, a shingle mill, and a lat mill. A planing mill plus 14 drying kilns and 30 warehouses completed the manufacturing complex. At their peak, the combined mills consumed 285,000 board feet of timber a day. That equaled 90 train car loads of logs, or an average of 70 acres of forests cut daily. Most of the logs were carried to the mill on the company's railroad trams. When it was too expensive to extend the tracks to the cutting site, wagons pulled by teams of horses or mules were used. Sometimes it was possible to use water to move the logs to the mill. When the company cut forests near the current river, the logs were floated downstream in big drives to a point where the railroad crossed the river near Chicopee. There they were pulled from the river, loaded onto railroad flat cars, and hauled into Grandin. The whole tree to mill process began with the felling crew. To show off the whole business, the logging company often staged photographs, including many different operations in one picture. Notice the felling crew in the foreground, the down tree in the background, and logs being skidded and loaded in the center. It took 14 horses or mules, 12 men, and 4 wagons to stage this single photograph. The felling crew cut or plucked the down trees into logs 12 or 16 feet long. All pine trees greater than 12 inches in diameter were cut. The crew skidded logs to a handy loading place and then pulled them sideways across 2 poles and onto the wagons. They depended on the strength of oxen for a while, but soon found that horses and mules cost less and worked more quickly. Some logging camps used more than 200 horses or mules at any one time. Depending on the terrain and the length of the haul, either 2 or 4 horses were needed to pull the loaded wagon to the closest yarding site. The teams often hauled the heavy wagons up to 8 miles. For greater distances, the company found it cheaper to build a spur line from the main railroad. Once the wagons reached the rail siding, the logs were rolled off and cross-hauled on the flat cars by mules or horses. A steam-powered log loader was introduced soon after 1900. The newfangled contraption didn't appeal to some people, but eventually it replaced the animals during this loading part of the operation. After the flat cars were loaded, a steam locomotive pulled them to Grandin. Many of the logs had been cut more than 50 miles from the mill. At Grandin, the cars were backed onto a sloped track, chains were released, and the logs tumbled freely into Tolliver Pond. This mill pond played an important part in the company's operation. It held a 3 to 4 day supply of logs for the mill. At the same time, the pond water loosened some of the debris still stuck to the logs. The water also made it easy to sort and float the logs to a sluice that carried them into the sawmill, completing the tree-to-mill process. Westward expansion and railroads boomed in the late 1800s. Though the loggers went after pine at first, they soon turned to hardwoods as the demand for railroad ties grew. Missouri's forests supplied many ties for the new railroads crossing the Great Plains. Timberlands that would yield a high percent of pine lumber were purchased. Oaks and hickories were often mixed with the pine trees, but were rarely cut into boards. Most were cut into railroad ties. The company used nearly 3,000 ties for each mile of its tram lines. In 1896, it entered into a partnership with the Smalley Tie and Timber Company at Chicopee to provide ties for their logging trams and for sale to other railroads. It took a lot of work to create the ties and get them to market. The process began upstream on the Current River and its many tributaries, where farmers were paid to hack ties at the rate of 10 cents per tie. The tie drives began in the summer and autumn months, when the risk of flash floods was low. Ties were added at various points along the river. Some of the drives gathered as many as 500,000 ties. For the most part, a drive averaged little more than 1 mile per day. Shallow shoals frequently snagged timbers, causing enormous jams, sometimes containing tens of thousands of ties. These jams were dangerous and time-consuming to pick apart. Some of the larger drives took over 3 months to complete. A boom extending 2/3 of the way across the river was constructed at Chicopee. This man-made wall, marking the end of the drive, caught the floating timbers while allowing the river water to flow through it. A steam-operated tie puller winched the timbers out of the river at a rate of 5,000 per day. You had to be fast to work the tie puller or face a huge backup behind the boom. And there was always the fear that pressure from a sudden rise in the river or a large number of ties might break the boom, sending thousands of ties downstream. The ties were stacked at the side of the tracks for loading into boxcars. When the cars became available, a traveling gang of black workers began the backbreaking work. Each man balanced a waterlogged tie on his shoulder before carrying it into the boxcar. Some of the ties weighed between 300 and 400 pounds. River drives were an inconvenience to the people living near the Current River. Jams often blocked the river for days. They flooded property, barred passage across fords, and endangered people crossing on horseback or in wagons. A less controversial method of bringing ties downstream was tie rafting. Tie rafts, or snake rafts as they were called, were assembled in blocks. Each block contained 30 to 50 ties lying side by side. It took only 3 to 4 days to bring a raft down the river. Long cook boats and supply boats powered by motors and paddle wheels followed the crew. When evening came, the raft was pulled close to the bank and tied to trees. Big changes happened when the sawmills and railroads came to the Ozarks in the 1880s. Before that, life in the rugged hills was very tough and very basic. In 1880, the population of Carter County averaged a little more than 3 persons per square mile. The big mills brought more people to the area and prosperity to some of the natives. By 1900, Grandin's population had increased to 3,000 people, of which 1,200 were employees of the company. Grandin was different from most frontier boom towns. The Missouri Lumber and Mining Company owned and controlled every aspect of the town. Married workers lived in company-owned houses. Skilled workers and managers rented painted homes with several rooms for $5 to $10 a month in 1895. Common laborers lived in small unpainted frame shacks that rented for $2 to $2.50 per month. Unmarried workers stayed in company-maintained boarding houses. The ladies' boarding house, formerly named White Hall, was called Deer Park by the men of Grandin. It was home for the young ladies employed in the offices, store, and school. House rules dictated meals to be served punctually and all lights were to be out by 10 in the evening. The company furnished lumber and land to build 4 different denominational churches. It was standard practice for the company to donate $10 monthly to each of the institutions, provided they held services on 4 Sundays each month. From its beginning, the company provided a dispensary, a hospital of sorts, complete with a drugstore and operating room. 3 physicians and a pharmacist tended the needs of the townspeople. Medical dues were $1.25 a month for married men and 75 cents for single men. Lumbering at the turn of the century was a dangerous occupation, filled with accidents. However, malaria accounted for 1/6 of all ailments treated at the dispensary. The Grandin School was also built by the company and provided a grade school curriculum plus a 3-year high school course. The town had its own post office, fire department, and gymnasium. There was a Grandin band and even a town baseball team sponsored by the company. From the beginning, Grandin was a law and order community. Drinking, gambling, carousing, Sunday baseball, and town picnics were all strictly forbidden by the company. A violation by an employee could mean the loss of their job and housing.
Question of labor. Our God made
Politicians and dignitaries enjoyed speaking to the news-hungry audience at Grandin. The town was quite modern compared to most in the Ozarks. Electric lights lit all of the mills, plus the company store, barber shop, hotel, and hospital. None of the homes were electrified, though. At the company store, one could find all the goods carried in a bigger city: shoes, clothes, hardware, sporting goods, and food. A week's supply of groceries cost $2. Many of the workers lived at distant logging camps. Houses, barns, and blacksmith shops were provided at some of the larger camps, but workers in the small camps lived in tents. Boards were placed around the tent bases to keep out the open range hogs. Most of the camps had a small church. Each week, a converted logging car carried a small version of the company store to the camps. Doctors made their rounds to the camps on a rail-mounted dispensary. After an area had been thoroughly logged, it was time to move to a new spot. They simply loaded the camp houses onto flat cars and carried them to uncut forests. Getting paid on time was a big concern of most of the workers. The Grandin workers were paid in cash once a month, while workers at neighboring mills were not as fortunate. They were paid with coupons and tokens that were redeemable only at their company's store. Guards accompanied the paymaster as he traveled by train to the camps. News that the payroll was on its way was telephoned ahead, and crowds of anxious workers usually gathered for the pay car. A typical felling crew earned $1.50 a day. Work days averaged 10 hours, and a work week was 6 days. Each two-man crew was expected to cut 10,000 board feet of logs a day. If you cut less, you didn't get paid. A top loader earned $2.50 a day. He's the man on top of the carload of logs. His job was dangerous and very important. At any time, the load of logs could shift and crush him. If he caused the logs to be loaded improperly, the whole load might roll off en route to the mill. Such an accident could derail the train, taking lives and interrupting the flow of logs to the pond. A log scaler was a skilled laborer, also earning $2.50 a day. He determined the amount of lumber measured in board feet that was in each log. All woods workers were paid according to the volume measured by the scaler. Not everyone working at Grandin was a company employee. Many were contracted laborers. A contract teamster provided his own horses and equipment, and then only earned $1.50 to $2.50 for every 1,000 board feet of logs hauled. Working conditions at the sawmills were different, but equally as harsh as the loggers. Each morning at 4 a.m., the mill whistle blew for 5 minutes to wake the mill workers. The work shift started at 6 a.m. and ended 11 hours later each day. Unskilled mill workers earned $1.50 a day. Others, like machinists, saw filers, and other skilled workers, earned wages comparable to their talents. Wages were kept equal to the neighboring mills for fear of losing the men to competitors. More than 200 men worked in the company's railroad department. They constructed the hundreds of miles of tramways through the rugged Ozark hills. Trams were never intended to be permanent. Their rough and bumpy tracks usually followed the ridges and flat valleys. Tram beds were blasted and leveled through rough ground with rocks and earth being moved by hand and animal power. The Ozark streams are known for their ability to flash flood. These unpredictable natural catastrophes inflicted frequent damage to the tram beds and trestles. Collisions with other trains were frequent. Since the mill pond held only a 4-day supply of logs, wrecks had to be cleaned up quickly. Logs and equipment were not the only items moved by rail. Employees traveled from camp to camp on hand cars called speeders. On special occasions, a company train would haul employees to Van Buren, where they would gather for picnics and social functions held at Big Springs. Missouri lumber production peaked in 1899. By 1906, when national production peaked, the Grandin Mill was winding down. Most of the pine lands adjacent to Grandin had been cut, and the main supply of logs came from faraway Shannon County. Prior to closing down the operation, Tolliver Pond was drained, revealing nearly 2 million board feet of usable logs. On September the 25th, 1909, the Grandin Herald newspaper eulogized the final day of operation at the mill by printing that the whistle of the Missouri Lumber and Mining Company whistled for the final time. The sawmilling operation was moved to West Eminence in 1909, leaving behind many unemployed workers to scratch out a living from the poor, rocky soil. Cattle and other animals grazed the forests, compacting the earth and eroding the trails. Decades of local fires laid bare the thin soil, which then washed into nearby streams. The mills had cut most of the large pine trees, which could have provided seeds to start new pine stands. That loss, combined with annual range burning, led to a new dominance of oak trees in the Ozarks. The Grandin era was an awakening period for Americans. Nationwide, they were beginning to see that resources like the forests needed care if they were to continue. The days of vast stands of virgin timber were gone. The new science of forestry was underway. The U.S. Forest Service itself was formed in 1905. In 1907, Yale University sent its senior forestry class to Grandin to study logging and milling operation in the Ozark forests. Today, University of Missouri forestry students continue that tradition of first-hand field experience at a summer camp near Wapapella. In the 1930s, the U.S. Forest Service, Missouri Department of Conservation, and the University of Missouri began to work together with Missourians to change old habits and share new ideas about caring for our forests. Preventing unnecessary fires, fencing cattle out of woodlands, and cutting with a thought to future wood production all began to change Missouri's forests. Cutting provides wood for all kinds of products, from lumber to fine furniture. 10 to 20 acre clear cuts create important food and habitat for ruffed grouse, deer, and wild turkeys. Grandin shrank from a boomtown community of 3,000 to its present size of a few hundred persons. The lumber drying yards are now fields, revealing little of their past. The company headquarters building is the Masonic Lodge, and Whitehall is a private residence. The extensive network of tram lines, overgrown with large trees and brush throughout much of the Ozarks, have been replaced by roads and highways. The sounds of the big mill are memories now, and Tolliver Pond is once again a quiet, secluded place. Only a few rusting and charred fragments of its past remain. Large, mature trees grow where the rails once rounded the pond. Healthy forests cover much of the Ozarks, and Missouri is once again a land of riches.
Well, I hope I didn't hold you too late. I hope you enjoyed it. It's very educational, I think. Of Carter Dean's great-great-grandpa lived at Riverside and did some of those river drives. I used to hear him talk about it.
Lot of hard work.
A lot of hard work. There was nothing but hard work. Okay. There's a bathroom in the back corner. Refreshments over here. Hope you can stay for refreshments and talk a little and ask questions. You can look at this and look at the museum. So, thank you all.
For you.
Uh-huh.